Good afternoon. So this week we are speaking to Nathan Hayes as part of Boo Consulting. So maybe Nathan, do you want to just give us an overview? Who you are? What do you do?
Yeah.
And,
So
go from there.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm obviously Nathan. I'm a senior data protection consultant with Boo Consulting Limited. We're based in not always so sunny Cornwall, in Newquay.
Yep.
I've worked in data protection for the best part of 10 years now. I very, very much and genuinely enjoy doing what I do. I enjoy helping businesses to achieve compliance with data protection laws.
Most people probably wouldn't say that, oh, data protection is my dream job that I want to get into. Is that how you started off? What's your journey been like?
No, I fell into data protection entirely by accident. So I was getting towards the end of my second year at uni down here in Cornwall, gearing up for my third year, and noticed that my employment law lecturer had left the university and set up a GDPR consultancy and was looking for people to help out with that. So I reached out to her and said, can I be of any help? And she said yes. So I shadowed her on a couple of GDPR audits, as they were. We call them data protection audits now. Sometimes GDPR audits still, depends. Same difference, I suppose. And then very much got thrown in at the deep end, conducting GDPR audits on various different organisations, a chocolate factory, multi-academy trusts. I did a slaughterhouse, an abattoir to be a little bit more PC.
Yeah.
So that's where it started for me, and I found that obviously I did a foundation degree in law because I was interested in law, and still am interested in law, and obviously data protection is a piece of law, so I was inherently interested in it anyway, and found that I really, really enjoyed it, and I think being thrown in at the deep end sort of accelerated my the excitement of it and the interest in it quite a lot, to be honest. So I found that I really, really enjoyed it, and I still do after nearly 10 years.
Yeah, no, that's really good. That's really good. I think that's true with quite a lot of maybe compliance professionals find that they've fallen into the role, but all seem to really thrive on it. I hear some people say like some people think you have to be a certain kind of person, but I think once you really get into the detail and kind of see where it really matters, that's then when people get more passionate about things. But that's good.
Yeah,
you were saying, oh sorry, yeah.
That's okay. No, I was just going to say, yeah, perhaps that's true for some people. Perhaps it's not. I don't know. For me, I mean, when I was younger, I wanted to be an electrician and join the army and all sorts of different things. So and things changed as I got older, and now I've just found that I've not just got a job anymore. I've got a career. So, it's just the way it works.
Yeah. No, excellent. Cool. No, great. So something you touched on there was about the change from it being GDPR to what did you call it? Data protection law?
Data protection, yeah. So data protection is a bit more all-encompassing. So the GDPR is one piece of law that's part of data protection, but in the UK we've also got the Data Protection Act, which is stemmed from the GDPR, and it includes like certain exemptions in the GDPR. So the GDPR basically, when it was first written from an EU perspective, and obviously still exists in the EU in its almost original form, there have been some minor changes over the years, I suppose, allowed for member states of the EU to make their own decisions about certain things. So, like the age of consent was recommended to be 16, but can be 13. So in the UK, it's currently 13. So that was a piece, a little bit of an area where the GDPR said member states can allow for a little bit of variance in that. So there's certain exemptions that are variants as well. Now it's a bit different. Obviously, since Brexit, we've got the UK GDPR, which for all intents and purposes is almost identical to the EU GDPR. So there's not really huge difference there. There are a few different things, but nothing too complicated, I want to say.
Okay. Sure. Okay.
Depends who you are, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I guess, and I guess on if you were to say or explain what's really encompassed by it at a top level, because most people don't know. I suppose they think it's it's my information, like my email address, my name and address being, obviously I don't want that shared with Tom, Dick, and Harry.
Absolutely.
And people see, websites these days, all you see is cookies at the beginning, having to accept various cookies and so forth. I mean, is that the core of it, or is it I'm sure it's a much bigger sort of area.
It's a much bigger fish than just someone's name and email address and cookies. So cookies are actually, the use of cookies are actually regulated by a different law which is the Privacy and
Okay.
Electronic Communications Regulations, which we call PECA for short.
Mhm.
So although the two, the PECA and the GDPR stuff sits side by side and goes hand in hand, there are differences and they do regulate different things. So
Okay.
people that do a lot of marketing need to consider PECA, essentially. The GDPR and data protection ultimately stems from the fundamental human right that we all have for the right to respect for a private and family life. So data
Okay.
protection law, which includes GDPR, obviously helps to protect that right, and basically says that any business, regardless of size and sector and industry, has to protect people's personal data at every level
Okay.
in the best way as they possibly can. What that looks like for each business is different, and the GDPR is what's called a principles-based law.
What does
So
that mean?
a rules-based law would be you must do this, you must not do that, for example. Whereas a principles-based law is very much here's a set of principles that you need to follow, but you've got some freedom in how you do that.
Okay. But I suppose in
Essentially,
that there's still an expectation you must have done something
absolutely,
to
yeah.
demonstrate you're complying with that
You've
principle.
absolutely got to demonstrate compliance. And one of the key themes of the GDPR is accountability, which basically means businesses should be able to demonstrate their compliance with the other principles of data protection, or the
Okay.
GDPR
So let's
specifically.
so if we were to kind of drill, 'cause I think you alluded to it earlier about electricians and so forth. They, if you were to speak to one of those, then they would probably think, well, what's it got to do with me? I'm Joe Bloggs, and all I do is
Yeah.
fit lighting all day. How would that apply to, like, what would be? Is there an expectation or not?
There is an expectation for every single business in the UK, regardless of what they do, who they are, how big the business is, whether it's one person or a million people, and everything in between, of course, to comply with the GDPR.
Okay. And do you have an example of what that might look like for sort of Joe Bloggs and Sparky.com?
It looks the same regardless of who they are. So there's no variation. The GDPR doesn't allow for sole traders to do less.
Mhm.
And it doesn't say that bigger businesses have to do more. They may do more inherently because they do different things as a bigger business, perhaps. But
Mhm.
there's nothing in the GDPR that specifically says you only have to do this if you're a sole trader. You've still got to follow all of the principles and comply with all of the principles, regardless of size. It doesn't look any different. It will look different because every
Mhm.
business will do things differently.
Yep. Okay.
But
So that might sound quite scary then to, say some of our listeners who thought maybe it didn't apply, but in practical
possibly,
terms, yeah, in practical terms, say it was me and you owned a small electrical business.
yeah,
We had a number of different customers ranging from domestic and commercial.
yeah.
What type of data exists that's considered personal that I might need to be controlling?
So the definition of what constitutes personal data is quite broad.
Mhm.
For the most part, it's going to be names, email addresses, home addresses, phone numbers. That's going to be the core data that the most businesses are going to process. But it
Mhm.
can go further. There are little things as well around a postcode on its own can't be personal data. An entire address on its own isn't necessarily personal data unless it's linked to a name. Then it becomes personal data.
I see.
So there
Okay.
are little things like that I mean, a lot of businesses won't necessarily understand what GDPR is and what it's all about, let alone understanding those little nuances from within the GDPR and other data protection law as well. Which
Uh,
for me is where the fear comes from around whether they need to comply or not. It's just a lack of understanding, and it's not
mhm.
necessarily their fault that they don't understand it either.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. No. True. Because I think it's going into business is a tough job in itself, but then having to
Absolutely
worry
agree. Yeah.
about all of these things where you're worried about, well, if I don't do this thing correctly, I'm going to get fined. But the time to spend
Yeah.
investigating that, you've still got a business to run at the end of the day.
Yeah, for sole traders, particularly tradespeople, they're out and about, probably 8 till 6, if not longer, 5, 6, maybe 7 days a week on the tools, so to speak. Which means, have they got an awful lot of time, aside from doing quotes and invoicing and things like that? Have they got loads of time to be focusing on data protection and other things as well? It's not just data protection businesses have to comply with. There are lots of other things as well, but
Mhm.
that's beyond my areas of expertise, of course. But it's still there. It doesn't mean they don't have to comply with it. But have they
Mhm.
got the time to do it as well? Because it's not, I mean, complying with data protection law is not a simple process. And a lot of people you mentioned earlier about tick box exercises. Data protection is not in any way, shape, or form a tick box exercise. It's a journey, and unfortunately, it's a journey that will never ever be end. It's one of those things. No business will ever be 100% compliant, and that's okay. That's accepted in the industry, and that journey is made up of a lot of tick box exercises along the way. But in and of itself, it's not a tick box exercise. It is a journey, and sometimes that journey is rough and hard, and other times it's smooth and easy. But organisations like us exist to guide businesses through that, along that journey, along that road, and try and make it as easy as possible for them.
Have you got any sort of not scare stories, but any sort of really bad examples of the consequences of ones who haven't taken this seriously?
There are lots. There are lots out there. I think that quite a lot come out of the EU more than the UK in terms of enforcement. A lot of the what we call data protection authorities or supervisory authorities. So in the UK, we've got the Information Commissioner's Office, or the ICO, or all the EU member states have one as well. CINIL, CINL is the French one, for example. And there are obviously loads whose names I cannot remember or just do not know. But I think some enforcement agencies, some regulators are a lot more on it, if you like, so to speak, and will fine organisations for, I want to say, smaller things than just big things, and that might not necessarily be the right way of phrasing it, but ultimately, as I've mentioned already, GDPR requires businesses to be accountable and to demonstrate their compliance, and if usually a supervisory authority will get involved if something's gone wrong. So they've had a data breach that's been reported to them, or someone's made a subject access request and they're not happy with the response, so they complain to the supervisory authority, who then get involved. And because they're involved, they dig a bit deeper. Most of the time in the UK, the Information Commissioner's Office will order businesses to do things so that they can then demonstrate compliance rather than just fine them straight away off the cuff. But I imagine, and I don't work for the ICO, so I don't know how they operate in that sense, but I imagine they do that because they don't want to scare businesses into thinking they're going to get fined. It's probably more a case of, look, we'll give you an opportunity to correct what you've got wrong. If you don't correct it, we're then going to fine you. But there are instances as well where businesses have made, and this is in the UK, like millions and millions of what we call unsolicited marketing calls, and they've been processing data without the correct lawful basis and things like that, where they've been fined substantial sums of money.
Okay. I mean, some people use, for example, mailing lists that they might have purchased online. Is there there's an inherent danger in that, but are there any sort of good practices that ones can put in place to help?
There's nothing that stops businesses purchasing mailing lists per se, but if I had a business and I wanted to purchase a mailing list, I would, in terms of GDPR and data protection, be looking to make sure that the people whose names appeared on that mailing list had given consent to the original owner of the mailing list for that mailing list to be sold.
Okay. And is there a way of
then you also
doing that, or?
Well, yeah. Before you even collect the data as a business, if the only lawful basis is not always consent. So there are 6 lawful bases that businesses can use to process data. When businesses use consent has to be very, very clear. It has to be specific and explicitly given, and it has to be opt-in. So there can't be any sort of implied or inferred consent. It has to be, yes, I consent to this happening. Okay. Essentially. Okay. So if I was asked, do you want your name and email address to be on our marketing list? And I said, yes, that's fine. And that can be a tick box. It can be another method. It doesn't matter so much, as long as it's clear and explicit, and again, has to be demonstrable by the business that's obtaining the consent from the individual as well. So they have to be able to demonstrate they've received that consent very, very clearly. But then they could also ask me, are you happy for us to sell our mailing list to other businesses so that they can send you marketing communications? If I said no, then my information can't be on the mailing list that gets sold. If I said yes, then it can be. But it has to be very clear what my personal data has been used for and what I'm giving consent to. It has to be very, very clear.
How much would you believe companies are doing that? So even if they're asking for that on their website, how much do we believe they're really doing?
I personally don't believe the vast majority of companies that buy and sell mailing lists are obtaining the proper consent. I obviously can't. I'm not going to tar everyone with the same brush. There will be businesses that do have those practices that do absolutely do everything by the book, but there will also be businesses that don't do anything by the book at all, and there's probably some businesses in between as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the whole stigma of it is that everybody believes their data is being stolen and used without consent. Anyway, that's like almost a status quo that you're trying to build from.
Yeah, it makes things difficult sometimes.
So, if we go back to our electrical company that we've got,
yes.
So what? I suppose say we got to the end of the year and we wanted to approach our customers with a special offer, or we've now got these, a different type of service that we now offer. Where does it fit in terms of our rights to go and contact them to offer that?
There are several avenues we could go down. So firstly, that would be a marketing communication. So yes, GDPR plays a part, but also you've got to look at the PECA, which we discussed earlier. That plays a part as well. So if we wanted to send marketing communications to our customers, we would ultimately want them to have given us their consent for us to do that. However, there is in PECA, it's not explicitly called the soft opt-in in PECA, but it's known as what's called the soft opt-in. So if you have a customer and you meet certain requirements, which I'll talk about in a minute, you can then send marketing communications to said customer without their consent if it's about your own same or similar products or services. So if we were offering electrical installation only, and then we wanted to say, oh, look, we can now do electrical inspection and testing, that's same or similar. So we could market that under the soft opt-in. If we said, oh, we're also going to start selling fridges and freezers, that's too far away from the original service that we're offering. So we couldn't do that under the soft opt-in. Coming back to those requirements, to be able to rely on what we call the soft opt-in, you have to give customers the opportunity to opt out of receiving those further marketing communications before you send them. So if they opt out, then obviously you can't send them. And you also have to give them the option to opt out in every communication you send to them, which is why you get your unsubscribe links in emails.
Yeah.
Essentially. So it's just, again, it's one of those nuanced things that's there that not a lot of businesses know about, potentially. The lawful basis stops being consent and it becomes legitimate interest. So it's in our legitimate business interest to do that. But then if a business relies on legitimate interest for processing data for any reason, they also then have to complete a legitimate interest assessment to make sure and evidence and show that their legitimate business interests outweigh the rights and freedoms of the individuals whose data they're processing under that lawful basis. So again, yes, you can rely on doing that, but there's more work that goes with it.
Okay. I suppose a legitimate business interest that we need to obviously retain their information is for things like invoicing and things like that.
And that would be under the lawful basis of contract, because you've got a contract in place. It doesn't have to be written, of course. In the business world, contracts aren't a necessary requirement, and you don't have to have a contract in writing. Contracts can be verbal, although it's obviously much more difficult to enforce a verbal contract. Contracts can be in writing, can be verbal. It doesn't have to be a physical, this is a contract document. It can just be emails and text messages, for example, could form parts of a contract. So
prove there's an engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
So I mean, I guess talking, because we want our listeners to kind of understand how this impacts them, regardless of what size. So I mean, if we go, something that many do is then referrals. So I'm going to refer another service or maybe option, or say I've been in talks with Margaret. Margaret said that she's looking for a conservatory or whatever, and then we end up speaking to our builder. Oh, Margaret's looking for a conservatory here. Contact her. Yeah. That would be in breach of GDPR if we kind of did that without any prior consent.
Technically, it could be in breach. You would want Margaret's consent to pass that information on to our builder. So, hi, Margaret. Are you happy for us to speak to our builder about you wanting a conservatory? Yes, that's fine. Okay, then you go and speak to the builder.
Okay. And so in that case,
you'd probably want to send that in an email rather than a conversation, because then you've got that record of her saying, yes, that's fine.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was just going to ask. Is that and what would your responsibility be to our builder? Do we have to ensure that he's now not, because there's that knock on then, isn't it? Now he's got the ability to pass that information on to someone else.
Yeah. So he becomes a data controller in his own right when he takes on that job, if it's his own separate business.
So
we've shared that data with him.
Yeah. So you talk me through, because there's a data controller and there's a data processor. Is that
Yeah, so there's
right?
different relationships. So your data
Yep.
controller is an organization that determines the means of processing. So your
Okay.
direct customers, you're the data controller of your customers' data. However,
Okay.
you've got a CRM system that you put your customers' data into. Let's use Zoho as an example. So you've got
Hmm.
Zoho CRM or Biggins, like a stripped down CRM that they offer. Whatever it is you use, it could be anything. HubSpot,
Yep.
you name it, Salesforce,
Yep.
whatever. They are the data processor because they're
Okay.
processing your customers' data on your behalf,
Okay. Okay.
essentially. But you can also have joint controller relationships. So that's where two
Yep.
data controllers jointly decide the means of processing. And then you can have a controller to controller relationship, which is where a data controller passes the information on to another data controller who then also determine their own means for the processing. So I
And where
think
would that
I
happen?
think well, it depends on the business. So a lot of the time, an accountant would be a controller to controller because you're the controller of your employees' data, but you're passing some of that data to your accountant for tax and accounting reasons. But they also have
Mm.
their own reporting obligations that they have to abide by, which would then make them a controller in their own right of that information.
Okay. I see. I see.
Some people might argue they're a joint controller. Depends
Okay.
on who you speak
Okay.
to be
And
honest.
so as a as a and so, like with our example to the builder, he becomes a data controller. But is there any expectation
Yeah.
on us as to what he does, or that's all his own
So
responsibility?
when a data controller shares data to another data controller, it's not quite as strict as it is with a controller sharing to a processor. So I'll come on to that in a minute. So when you're sharing data to a data controller, you would want to probably do a little bit of a research on the other controller to make sure that they're not going to start doing anything they shouldn't do with it. But once
Mhm.
you share the data with them, they're then responsible for their own compliance
Okay.
just as much as you are for your compliance. Whereas if you share with a data processor, and you need to do due diligence on them to make
Okay.
sure that they are compliant with data protection law because you're still responsible for that data even though they're processing it on your behalf. The data controller is ultimately the responsible party.
Okay. I see.
So
Yep.
if something went wrong at the data processor's end, the data controller is still responsible for that, although if the processor can be shown to be at fault, it can mitigate the controller's liability
Hmm.
potentially up to 100%, but not likely because if something's gone wrong and it's found that the processor is non-compliant and you've not done your due diligence properly on them to make sure that they're compliant, then obviously you're in trouble for not doing that in the first place.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I guess that's where that kind of applies to. For example, we're a software business, so one of the purposes of the
Yeah,
software is that other companies load their data into it, and that can be clients' data or their own data. So
yeah,
we're processing it, but we obviously have to have controls in place that that data is secure the entire time that they're
absolutely.
processing. Mm.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
things like encryption. I mean, I'm not a cybersecurity expert by a long shot, but
Yeah.
things like encryption. It's good if you've got ISO 27001 help. Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus are all good credentials to have to show that you are taking security seriously and you actually have got controls in place to
Mhm.
enact that security as well. So
Mhm.
that's what we look for when you do due diligence as a data controller on a processor. You want them to show you that they've got things like ISO 27001 in place, like they've got SOC 2 in place, perhaps they've got Cyber Essentials in place, because then you
Okay.
can see that they're taking things seriously,
Okay. Okay. Yeah, and you can see that in the
amongst
industry,
other
people are
things, of
becoming,
course. But
yeah, a
yeah,
lot more people expecting, cyber essentials at a minimum across sort of businesses
absolutely.
and so
Yeah,
forth.
so businesses, private sector businesses that want to work with any sort of government and public sector bodies are most of the time required to have at least Cyber Essentials in place now as a
Mhm.
minimum. Some
Mhm.
will require Cyber Essentials Plus, and then some will require ISO 27001.
Mhm. Yeah.
Otherwise, you don't
Yeah.
even get a look in when you're tendering for contract.
Yeah. Yeah. And no, that's really useful to understand. Is there like a, not a quick fire list, that's the wrong phrasing, but is there a sort of top
Hmm.
hits that if you were starting a business tomorrow, you'd want to ensure you have in place to kind of get set
So
off on the right foot?
technically, you need everything in place, and
Mhm.
there's part of data GDPR is what's called data protection by design and by default,
Okay.
and that is quite often misconstrued because it seems to be geared towards implementing a new piece of software, for example, you'd want to follow data protection by design and by default insofar as you're designing data protection measures into that system, and data protection is the default setting for everything. So like the highest security setting. Obviously, users can reduce that setting down if they want to, but it should be by default the highest setting when a user first starts using that platform. And that's how it seems that data protection by design and by default is geared. However, if you really look at it, it technically means that a brand new business should be designing data protection into their processing, into everything that they do from the get-go.
I see. Okay. Yeah, great.
So, and it's not just about having a privacy notice on your website. I prefer the term privacy notice. Could be a privacy policy. The GDPR calls them fair processing notices. So, multiple names for the same thing, but they all achieve a purpose. But it's not just about that. And whilst it might make you look externally like you know what you're doing if you've got a really good privacy notice on your website, that's not the be all and end all. And it's what happens in the background as well. Data subjects, so people whose data has been processed, don't see all the policies and procedures in the background that make sure that their data is safe.
So what would you suggest sort of creating? Are there any terms for documents, spreadsheets and stuff? What would you suggest the company starts with?
I'll give you a non-exhaustive list. So of what. So there's what we call mandatory documentation. So you need privacy notices. You don't just have one; you have several. So you wouldn't include all your customer stuff, but what you're doing with your customers in your employee privacy notice. You wouldn't put them together. You'd separate them out.
Okay.
So on your website, you would have a privacy notice that goes, if you visit our website, we get your IP address and your MAC address, for instance. If you fill in a form on our website, we'll get your IP address and your MAC address, but we'll also get your name and your email address, maybe a phone number, depends on obviously what the form is that's been filled in, and we'll get your query. If you then become a customer, we've got all of this extra information about you as well. And then you'd have your employee privacy notice that says we've got your name, your address, your bank details so we can pay you. We collect your passport for right to work checks, which you've got to do. There's lots of different things to consider there. You need a data protection policy, which shows, and it's not necessarily, data protection policy isn't necessarily a public document, it's more of an internal document, but that sets out how a business is going to comply with the GDPR. So this is what we'll do to comply with the principles. This is what we'll do to comply with data subject rights. So a lot of businesses, and I see this a lot, they will have a policy and a procedure around subject access requests, which is where a data subject or an individual can request what information is held about them from a business. And that's what's called an absolute right. So every person has got the right to request access to their data from a business who processes their data. But then you've also got the right to erasure, for instance, which is sometimes known as the right to be forgotten, which is where a data subject can go, I want you to delete my data. Well, that's what we call a qualified right. So if the business has got a continuing lawful basis to process that person's data, they can then go, no, I'm not deleting your data. Obviously, you wouldn't be quite so blunt like that, but but
and what, just as an example on that, have you got an example of where that might apply? Like somebody wants
to erasure.
Well, somebody wants to have their data removed, and the company says no.
So I imagine if the right to erasure was an absolute right, every single person in the UK would immediately make a right of erasure request to everyone that they owe money to, and ask them to remove their data, and then everyone would be debt free. Which is why it has to be a qualified right rather than an absolute right.
Okay.
So there's lots of different scenarios, and it's difficult to sit here now and talk through everything. It's sometimes you've got to, because the context could be very, very different from one client to another. So sometimes it's a matter of looking at what's in front of you and going, I know the law, I can see the situation, this is how we should proceed.
I guess the thing is that maybe the question that people might ask is, but are they ever going to check up on me? Like who's going to know? And
is who going to check up on me? Is the question.
I don't know. So I suppose like the ICO. So I mean, if you
so
you have to register with the ICO and
data controllers do have to register with the ICO, and there is, I can't remember if it's been enacted already or if it's in the process of being enacted. The government have basically put forward legislation for the ICO to increase their fees for data controllers by almost 30%. Which so data controllers, when they register with the ICO, there's 3 tiers of fees. So tier 1 is for charities, not for profits, and micro businesses. It was only 40 quid a year anyway, so 30%. It's not a huge jump on that, but it's still
Yep.
almost a third
Yep.
increase, so it's
Yep.
still quite a bit. Then you've got tier 2, which is for slightly bigger businesses, and I think that's 60 quid off the top of my head, or was, and obviously 30% on that. Then you've got tier 3, which is for your big players, and that was 2,900 a year, so that's jumped almost £1,000.
Yeah.
For them, but they've probably got the money to pay it. So in the grand scheme of things, it's an annual charge. It's not huge. Am I impressed that the government are increasing cost to businesses? Not particularly, but that's a story for another day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what is that for? So did you know who must register with the ICO? Every
business that processes personal data, unless you're processing core data, the definition of which I can't remember 100%, so I don't want to say it and get it wrong. But there are very, very limited circumstances where a business won't have to, aside from not trading and not actually having any data, there are very limited circumstances where a business doesn't have to register with the ICO, but I would say 98, 99% of the time you do. But most businesses in the UK are micro and small businesses, so they're only going to fall into tier 1 anyway, so it's not expensive, just to have that little safeguard in place, if you like.
Well, I suppose something that a lot of companies or people won't know before starting a company.
Absolutely.
And is it the ICO doesn't? Do they get in contact with you as soon as you've registered? I mean, what about sole traders?
So it's difficult with sole traders because there's no way of tracking them. But I do know that if you start a company, so obviously you register a company with Companies House, before too long you will receive a letter from the Information Commissioner's Office saying, "We've noticed you've got a company. You need to register with us as a data controller, unless you don't need to." And there is a form on the website that you fill in, and you go through some questions that shows you don't need to be registered as a data controller if you don't need to be, and then you send that off, and they leave you alone. Yeah, if you don't respond to the ICO about whether you need to register as a data controller or not, or they think that you do and you don't register, you can be fined. I think it's about £4,000.
Oh wow, yeah, that's quite significant. I think we had. I mean,
so for someone that's just starting a business, it would be.
Yeah, and I mean, we've been around for a few years now, but it was the same with us. We got the letter through, and the first thing we did was start googling. Well, who are the ICO?
Who are the ICO?
Yeah, are they legitimately asking for money?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a huge void of knowledge and awareness across the whole country about data protection laws and who the Information Commissioner's Office is and what they do, essentially.
And what is their job? I mean.
So the ICO's job is to regulate data protection law in the same way that the Health and Safety Executive regulates health and safety law. That's the easiest way of explaining their broad job. But they can also enforce, as the HSE can, they can enforce and prosecute in their own right for breaches of data protection law, which is where the fines come in. There are some circumstances where data protection law breaches can be criminal as well. So if people are doing things knowingly and purposefully, it becomes a criminal act. And again, the ICO can prosecute for that as well. That's essentially broadly speaking, what their role is. They also regulate freedom of information and environment regulations as well.
I guess, and if you spoke to two people on the street and you asked which was more important, HSE or ICO, they probably not even
almost
know
guarantee they would say HSE.
Yeah. Whereas essentially what you're saying is they stand on the same footing. It's just for different regulations. Yeah.
Absolutely.
No, fair enough. No, that's something good for our listeners to know. But I mean, trying to reduce the kind of stress and anxiety that it might be causing. Some kind of just hearing
inherently does.
What we were talking about things that they might want to start doing. So privacy policies, I suppose quite straightforward. Maybe the thing people didn't realize was that that's not just for your website. It actually applies to your staff and how you use customers.
Absolutely, and there are potentially other areas where you could have a privacy notice as well. Depends on what you do, basically. So,
and is there is there a best practice way of kind of capturing people's data then? And what's the best way of keeping it secure? I guess. Do you have any suggestions?
It's going to vary from business to business how data's captured. So Joe Bloggs, the plumber, is probably going to have a piece of paper he writes everything on. He might have an accounting system. Whether he or she uses that system directly themselves is a different question. They may not. They may have a bookkeeper or their partner at home might do it. So it just depends. So there's no best practice way to actually collect the data as such. In terms of security, it's about I mean, if you're at home, you could argue that your home's quite secure anyway. So, and if it's left on your desk and you're and your wife, you're and your husband, whatever, in the business, and you've not got any kids, then the data is pretty secure, just been left in as bits of paper on the desk. There is potentially an argument for that. I don't like the idea of that personally, and I would never advise that as a good course of action, of course. But there is an argument now to suggest that it is almost safer to have your password written down because you can't hack a piece of paper.
Yeah, unless it's the same password for everything.
There is that. In some context, though, if you were in a big office and you had your password stuck on a sticky note on your screen, which I've seen, then you couldn't prove that argument at all. But if you worked from home all the time and you had a little notebook and it was put in a cupboard out of the way, you could argue that that's more secure than having them stored on your computer or elsewhere, potentially. But I don't know. There's no one right answer in terms of security, and it will depend entirely on the business and how big they are as well. So the bigger businesses will need to have much more stringent security measures in place. But again, coming back, encryption is always good. So if data's encrypted at transit, in transit, and at rest, that's always good.
Yep.
Because then if it gets picked up without the decryption keys, it's useless nothingness, essentially. Yeah. There's things like access controls are important in businesses. So only giving access to data based, it could be role based, or it could be rule based. So this employee meets this set of rules, so they can access this set of data, or this employee's got this role, so they can access this set of data. Managers can obviously access a little bit more, and then head of department can probably access more again. But no one person should ever be able to access all data in a business.
Okay. And I suppose it's also then considering, where they're accessing it from and through what means. And I mean, there was somebody told me about a story of they were told by someone that even computer screens facing a window they need to be careful of.
Put privacy screens on them, privacy screens either on the PC monitor or on the window, on the glass. You get the sticky stuff you can put over it. It's something to consider, absolutely.
Yeah, I suppose especially if you're in a data center and you've just got call logs on your screen the whole day, then it's high risk.
Yeah. But then that's another element of data protection law is risk as well. What's the risk of processing this that has to be considered? So you do risk assessments on things, and it's like, what's the risk of processing someone's name and email address in an encrypted server that's on-prem, as we call it, so on our site in a locked room that's covered by CCTV? It's quite low. And then we do as well data protection impact assessments are a special kind of risk assessment. So every business, in theory, should do what's called a data protection impact assessment screening questionnaire if they're looking to do a new processing activity, which then the answers given to that screening show if a full, we call them DPIAs, data protection impact assessments, if a full DPIA is needed, and that's your full risk assessment based on that. So if there's any potential for the processing activity to be high risk, businesses should then do a data protection impact assessment on that, which then shows how they can mitigate that risk or completely alleviate that risk potentially.
And can you give us an example of what new type of processing you mentioned? If they're doing any new processing.
So it could be something. It could be migrating from one accounting or CRM system to another. It could be we've discovered a need that we now need to process this set of data in this different way. So that could be an example as well. And again, it comes back to data protection by design and by default as well.
I see, okay.
And then due diligence if you're going to be using a data processor.
So I suppose like our electrical business, we might have just always been capturing data for just general customer contact, but now we want to look at marketing to them. It's a different purpose for the data, and
it becomes a different kettle of fish. And technically, you technically can't process someone's personal data for a different purpose.
Okay.
Without if it's compatible with the original purpose, then there is a bit of a workaround there. But if it's completely different, then technically you can't do it. You've got to go through the whole process again of making sure that you've got a lawful basis, that your purpose is documented and defined, and you've got everything else sorted for it too.
So if you had 1,000 customers on your books, you would have to get what's the word? Confirmation.
Consent
from them before you even started.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you couldn't
Yeah.
just send the marketing communications. You'd have to get the consent first, unless the soft opt-in applies, of course.
Mhm.
But the chances are, if you've not even considered marketing until that point, you've not given them the opportunity to opt out of the soft opt-in in the first place, so you can't use it anyway.
Yeah. So I guess good because I mean, people starting up businesses, ensuring that they've got those systems in place before they get their first customers is the best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because then you've got everything there and it's to hand.
No, good. Yeah, I mean, it sounds you've definitely had a lot of experience in data protection. Sounds like you kind of know it like the back of your hand. That's
been around the block several times. Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. And there's probably a lot that I still don't know, but and I won't necessarily know it until I'm in front of it in the right context, with the right business. But I can then apply my knowledge of the laws and regulations to that particular scenario and provide an outcome.
And is that what you're doing currently with Boo Consulting?
So Boo Consulting is a privacy and risk consultancy. So as well as offering data protection services, we offer services around ISO certification, predominantly 27001. So we can carry out implementation, internal audits on ISO 27001, and gear businesses up for their external audits, their certification audits. And I believe as of date, we have got 100% success rate with that,
Yeah.
In terms of data protection, because obviously that's my focus is data protection, and obviously the PECA stuff as well alongside that. We carry out audits and gap analyses on businesses, and we do consulting, and we also offer an outsourced data protection officer service as well. So I'm currently a named data protection officer for 3 clients. I've got 3 to 4 clients that I'm running consulting projects with at the moment, and I've got several audits ongoing as well, or upcoming rather.
Okay.
Is there a sort
of typical? Yeah, and is there a typical trend that for example, I mean, I'm an aerospace assessor. That's my background. One of the critical elements that we always find is in terms of non-conformance corrective actions. Following up on the effectiveness, it's always a problem area for root cause. In aerospace specifically, it's human factors related issues as well.
Yeah.
So trying to address those, which most companies always fall foul on. Another area is probably counterfeit products.
Interesting.
Where just companies haven't considered, or they've kind of tick boxed it. So they've done maybe what the standard expects at a minimum level, but then not considered how it really applies to what they're providing.
Okay.
Done it. Yeah. Do you find the same?
Similar. Yeah, I think in terms of root cause analysis for why there are non-conformities, shall we say, it's probably lack of knowledge.
Okay.
Most of the time, it's lack of knowledge, or sometimes it could be that during what I call the GDPR boom, so late 2018, there were lots and lots and lots of people popping up as GDPR consultants, and I imagine most of them probably aren't in business anymore and probably never knew what they were doing. There will be some still out there that maybe didn't know what they were doing at the time, but have probably progressed and now perhaps potentially do know what they were doing. But I think businesses have probably inherited from other businesses like that, these pop-up consultancies that are like, let's jump on this bandwagon because it's going to be lucrative. They've probably inherited some really badly written policies and procedures that aren't worth the paper they're written on, for want of a better phrase. And then they just sort of run with that because their knowledge is lacking, and they think, oh, this person is an expert in GDPR. And it's like, how in 2018, when the GDPR has only been around for 2 years and isn't even enforceable, how can anyone be an expert in it? Well, you can't, essentially. Or not at that point, you couldn't be. But I think, and some businesses have probably had a stab at it themselves. They've probably updated old data protection policies from the Data Protection Act of 1998 and hoped that they were brought them into line with GDPR requirements and probably fell short a bit. A lot of the time you find that people working in finance departments have got responsibility for data protection. Don't know why. Just sort of seems to be the way it is.
It's the role that gets lumped with it.
A lot of the time. Sort of, and a lot of people in businesses, and I find this probably 95% of the time, aren't dedicated to that role as the data protection element of their role. It's just been dropped on them. It's just another hat that they've got to wear, and it's not their full-time job, so they can't commit enough time and resource to it to make sure it's right. That's a problem as well.
Where particularly, if we were talking about risks, I mean, where particularly would you say is the first area that is the highest risk for a company? Or again, does it depend on the context? I mean, it will.
It is very context specific. Yes, because obviously, again, different companies do different things, and even companies that occupy the same space in the same sector still operate differently to one another as well. So you can't even go, oh, this sector does it this way, and that makes life easier. It's because they don't. They're all individual, unique companies, so they all do things their own way, and it'll all be very different. I think company size is a factor as well. I mean, the biggest risk for data protection, people. Human risk is the biggest risk, and most of the communications we've had from clients is we've had a breach. 90% of the time, it's someone sent an email to the wrong person, or they've CC'd 100 people into an email that they shouldn't have CC'd into at all, or they've just done CC instead of BCC on an email. The vast majority of breaches that we come across, and it's human error.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I guess that's why, like I was saying, with the aerospace standard, it's looking at human factors to prevent human error. But what is there some key things that you would say a company should put in place as best practice to kind of mitigate that before it happens?
In terms of mitigating human error, good training and an awareness program will be the best thing to combat human error. When I say good training, I mean training that covers what it's supposed to cover about the GDPR. That training could be scalable as well. So if someone's coming in at a very entry-level position, everyone's responsible for data protection in a business, compliance, just as again, health and safety, everyone's responsible. Obviously, the business itself is ultimately responsible, but everyone's got a responsibility to try and support that. And someone that's coming in bottom entry level at the bottom of the ladder, their responsibility will be quite low level. So it's about, rather than giving them a 3-hour PowerPoint presentation on, really in-depth GDPR and data protection, what they need to do, something a lot smaller and succinct and to the point would be more beneficial for them, especially as they're new to the role, they're learning, they've got a lot of other things to learn as well. So if you flood them with data protection, it's just going to defeat the object. If someone's coming in at a management level, chances are they've probably already had some sort of GDPR training in another role anyway. But their responsibility is a bit wider, so they would need to receive wider training. Training for data protection and security as well, including security, should always be delivered on induction and then repeated regularly. Doesn't say annually, it says regularly. Most of the time that is annually, but in certain roles you might want to repeat it quarterly or every 6 months perhaps as well. And then on top of that, supplement training with awareness. So a Teams channel. This has just happened in our industry in terms of data protection. Keep an eye out for it. Things like that. Posters in the office. If you've got an office space, put posters up. They don't have to be big and overbearing. It can just be small, little, simple things that just remind people as they're looking around the office. Remember this. Don't forget that. Just little things, and it makes a huge difference. Huge.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. Anything sort of, if we were talking about sort of physical things that have a risk of introducing leaks, so like laptops, if you've got company phones and
devices aren't necessarily the biggest risk, because if the laptop is locked, in theory it should be encrypted. No one's getting into it. And if the business knows what they're doing, they've got some sort of remote wipe function, and Jane Doe's, I've left my laptop on the table at Costa and I've come back out of the toilet and it's gone. No problems. You're going to be in trouble tomorrow morning when you get to the office, but tap, 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 wiped, done. So even if they do get into it somehow, it's useless. It's completely defunct. Same with phones. Most businesses that issue company devices that I've come across, my personal experience, have some sort of remote wipe feature on there for all their devices that they issue. So, if a laptop gets stolen or gets lost, the chances are it's not actually that serious. The more serious thing in terms of devices is going to be hackers. But obviously, there's a lot of simple steps you can take to prevent that as best as possible. I mean, if someone's committed, you're never going to stop them. There's always going to be a hole that a hacker can get through somewhere. But at the same time, making sure access controls are good, because the chances are that the people with the most important data that they can access are probably going to have more security in place than the people who haven't, and they're less likely to give away passwords and things like that. But it's about making staff aware of employees. I don't really like the word staff. Employees is a bit better. Staff seems quite detached. It's about making teams aware and people aware that if you've got a strong password, and the current guidance is a longer password that is changed less regularly now. And again, it's all about the passphrases now. Make sure there's numbers and symbols in there. For instance, the pound symbol, and I don't take credit for this, I got this off one of my colleagues. The pound symbol, because it doesn't appear outside the UK on keyboards, is a really good symbol to include in passwords if you're in the UK.
Okay. Well, so
it doesn't necessarily appear on, and I don't take credit for that advice at all.
Okay. That's good.
It's in my memory bank. Okay. There's lots of different things, and again, it's contextual to the business. Some businesses expect staff to be in the office all the time, and it's easier to secure an office because it's one place. And especially if you've got desktop PCs, they're not going anywhere. So again, that's easier. Whereas if you've got a lot of staff that work from home, I'm working from home today, for instance. I've got my company provided laptop with me, so I've got to make sure that no one else can get access to that laptop. Not that there's any people in my house ever that would be like that, but at the same time, I've got to make sure that my laptop's secure, that my internet's secure, and it's little things like change the SSID and password on your router.
Okay.
If you get a new router, make sure that the back of the router where the password and stuff are displayed aren't facing the window, so that people can look in and see, or the people can't look in and see it rather. So my router faces away from the window. I've got a different SSID than what it came with. I've got a different password than what it came with.
Okay. Yeah.
So people can't just jump on it and gain access to it.
Yeah.
So it's about making it difficult for people to hack into systems. And there's lots and lots of little things that can be done that take very little time and resource to make that easier.